command post.
The movie opens in the harsh, isolated mountains of Ethiopia, deep within Africa. The landscape is rugged and unforgiving, covered with tall grass that sways endlessly in the wind. Hidden among that vegetation are two American military snipers lying completely still. One is Bob Lee Swagger, a highly skilled marksman, and beside him is his longtime friend and spotter, Donnie. Their assignment is straightforward but extremely dangerous. They must remain concealed and provide sniper support while an American convoy safely retreats from the area. For hours, both men stay motionless, carefully observing the surroundings. Every second feels tense as they wait for the convoy to come into view. Eventually, they spot the vehicles moving across the distant terrain. For a brief moment, it seems as though everything is proceeding exactly as planned. Then the situation changes in an instant. An enemy truck armed with a mounted machine gun suddenly races into position. If that weapon opens fire on the retreating convoy, dozens of soldiers could be wiped out within moments. Despite the pressure, Donnie remains calm. Using his expertise, he quickly evaluates the wind conditions, distance, elevation, and bullet trajectory. After making the necessary calculations, he quietly relays the corrections to Bob. Bob settles behind his rifle and peers through the scope. His breathing slows. The crosshairs lock onto the target. A shot rings out. The bullet strikes perfectly, killing the machine gun operator immediately before he can fire a single round. Unfortunately, that successful shot doesn't end the threat. Within moments, a much larger group of enemy vehicles appears from another direction. The danger level instantly multiplies, yet Bob never loses his composure. He acquires another target and squeezes the trigger again. One shot eliminates another gunner. A second round punches into the driver of the vehicle, causing it to veer wildly out of control before flipping over. Every pull of the trigger demonstrates why Bob is considered one of the finest snipers in the military. His accuracy is nothing short of extraordinary. Even so, the enemy still can't pinpoint where the shots are coming from. Confused and panicked, they bring their vehicles to a halt and begin spraying bullets toward the surrounding hillsides. Gunfire erupts everywhere. Rounds tear through the landscape as Bob and Donnie realize their hidden position could be discovered at any second. Recognizing how desperate the situation has become, Bob contacts Forward Command and urgently requests support. What he hears in return leaves him stunned. Instead of assistance, the commanding officer orders the communication line to be cut immediately. At that moment, a painful reality becomes impossible to ignore. The two men risking their lives for their country have been abandoned. To the people making decisions from afar, they are merely expendable pieces on a board. Before Bob can fully process the betrayal, the situation spirals even further out of control. An enemy helicopter arrives. Now bullets rain down from every direction. The battlefield becomes absolute chaos. Amid the relentless gunfire, tragedy strikes. Donnie, Bob's closest friend and trusted partner, is killed right in front of him. The loss hits like a hammer. For a brief moment, it feels as though everything inside Bob collapses, but grief quickly transforms into fury. Driven by pain and determination, Bob grabs his powerful Barrett sniper rifle and begins firing at the approaching helicopter. Round after round slams into the aircraft, yet it continues advancing as if nothing happened. The helicopter closes the distance, seemingly preparing to eliminate him once and for all. Then Bob sees his opportunity. He steadies himself, waits for the perfect moment, and takes one carefully timed shot. Just one. The bullet finds exactly the right spot. Seconds later, the helicopter loses control, plummets from the sky, and explodes into pieces upon impact. Against all odds, Bob survives. But survival comes at a terrible cost. The man who walks away from that mountain is no longer the same person. He has lost his best friend. And worse, he has learned that the very system he served without hesitation was willing to leave him behind. Over the next 3 years, Bob disappears from society. He chooses a secluded existence deep in the wilderness, far from cities, government agencies, and military command. Living alone among the forests, he cuts himself off from the world and tries to leave his past behind. Yet destiny has a way of finding people when they least expect it. One day, a group of men in formal suits arrives unexpectedly at his remote hideout. Among them is Colonel Johnson. The colonel presents Bob with one of the country's highest military honors, the Congressional Medal of Honor. After the ceremony, he explains why they've come. According to intelligence reports, a highly trained sniper is planning an assassination attempt against the President of the United States. The shot is expected to be taken from an astonishing distance of roughly 1,600 meters. The government believes only someone with Bob's unique expertise can help identify the possible firing positions and prevent the attack. Bob immediately rejects the offer. His trust in the system vanished years ago, and he has no desire to become involved again. However, when the conversation shifts toward protecting his country and preventing a national tragedy, his sense of duty begins to resurface. Eventually, he agrees. Still, Bob isn't naive. His instincts tell him to remain cautious. Before leaving the area, he discreetly records the engine number of the vehicle that brought the visitors to his cabin. At the time, it seems like a minor detail, but later it will become an extremely important clue. To verify whether the proposed assassination scenario is realistic, Bob conducts his own test. Positioned on a mountain, he takes a shot from the same distance, approximately 1,600 meters. The moment the bullet reaches its target, a box placed at the impact point erupts in a powerful explosion. The demonstration proves beyond doubt that a skilled sniper could successfully make such a shot. Even after witnessing the results, Bob remains suspicious of the people around him. As an extra precaution, he secretly removes a critical component from his rifle, the firing pin mechanism, ensuring the weapon cannot be used without his knowledge. Afterward, he travels to Washington. Using his exceptional field experience and analytical skills, Bob begins inspecting multiple locations between Baltimore and Philadelphia, carefully studying every possible position from which the planned assassination could be carried out. After conducting a detailed analysis, Bob eventually narrows the possible attack locations down to 6 spots in Philadelphia. Out of all of them, one location stands out as the most effective and dangerous: the bell tower of a church. From that position, a highly skilled sniper could execute the shot with devastating precision. Once his assessment is complete, Bob submits the report to Colonel Johnson. In his mind, the assignment is finished. He believes he has done his part and can now walk away from the operation. However, Johnson has another request. He informs Bob that on the day of the presidential appearance, he must remain on site and assist as an observer. The request catches Bob slightly off guard, but after everything he has already contributed, it doesn't seem unreasonable. What Bob doesn't realize is that every step is drawing him deeper into a carefully designed setup. Soon, the day of the event arrives. From the very beginning, something feels wrong. The atmosphere is tense in a way Bob can't quite explain. Years of military experience have sharpened his instincts, and those instincts are telling him that something isn't adding up. While monitoring the area, he notices a police officer lingering near his position. The officer is unusually short, his equipment appears untidy, and he constantly scans the surroundings with nervous eyes. The behavior immediately catches Bob's attention. Still, the true threat isn't standing near him. Far above, inside the church bell tower, a professional assassin is already in position. The rifle has been calibrated using the exact calculations and recommendations Bob himself provided during his assessment. The shooter waits patiently. Wind speed, humidity, temperature, everything slowly falls into perfect alignment. The moment Bob realizes what is happening, he grabs his radio and attempts to send an urgent warning. But he is already too late. A rifle cracks through the air. Panic erupts instantly. The president remains unharmed, but an Ethiopian archbishop standing only a short distance away collapses after being struck by the bullet. Before Bob can even process what happened, disaster strikes again. The suspicious police officer suddenly turns and fires 2 shots directly at him. Within seconds, Bob's entire world is turned upside down. Only moments earlier, he had been regarded as a decorated war hero. Now, he is being portrayed as the man responsible for an assassination attempt against the president. The transformation is immediate. Authorities launch a nationwide manhunt, and Bob is rapidly labeled the country's most wanted fugitive. For the second time in his life, the system he served has abandoned him. Despite the gunshot wounds and the chaos surrounding him, Bob refuses to panic. His emotions remain under control. Police units flood the area. Helicopters circle overhead. Every available resource is deployed to capture him. To strengthen the false narrative, Bob's sniper rifle is conveniently left behind at the scene, making it appear as though all evidence points directly to him. As he searches for a way out, he crosses paths with a young FBI agent named Nick Memphis. Thinking quickly, Bob briefly pretends to surrender. Nick approaches cautiously, expecting resistance. Instead, Bob surprises him. He makes no attempt to attack or harm the agent. He simply tells him that he has been framed and that forces far more powerful than either of them are involved. Before Nick can fully react, Bob takes control of the agent's vehicle and escapes. The pursuit intensifies. With injuries slowing him down and law enforcement closing in, Bob desperately needs time to recover. He steers the vehicle into a car wash facility, hoping to buy a few moments of privacy. Inside, he retrieves a medical kit and begins treating his wounds. He cleans the injuries, controls the bleeding, and gathers enough strength to continue. Unfortunately, the break doesn't last long. The moment he emerges, police officers spot him again. Another high-speed chase begins. As vehicles close in from multiple directions, Bob suddenly finds himself trapped. A large truck blocks one side while police units seal off the road ahead. There appears to be no escape. Then he spots one final option. Without hesitation, he throws the vehicle into reverse and accelerates straight toward a nearby river. The car crashes into the freezing water below. For nearly 30 minutes, search teams comb the river while helicopters hover overhead looking for any sign of him. Nothing is found. Eventually, authorities reach a conclusion. They assume Bob drowned. But once again, Bob proves far harder to eliminate than expected. Unknown to everyone searching for him, he manages to survive by grabbing onto a sand-dredging vessel moving through the water. By the time he reaches shore, his condition is critical. His body is riddled with injuries, and blood continues to pour from multiple wounds. Barely able to stay upright, he enters a supermarket hoping to find supplies. That's when he notices a television broadcast. His face fills the screen. News stations across the country are portraying him as America's most dangerous fugitive. For a brief moment, the reality of his situation sinks in. Then his survival instincts take over. Thinking quickly, he grabs discarded aluminum foil and uses it to create an electrical short circuit. Within seconds, the entire store is plunged into darkness. While customers and employees panic, Bob quietly collects everything he needs: syringes, medication, bandages, and other essential medical supplies. After escaping unnoticed, he heads to a public restroom. There, completely alone, he administers treatment to himself, including fluids and emergency wound care. Every action reflects the discipline drilled into him during years of military service. Even under extreme pressure, he remains methodical and focused. Once his condition stabilizes, Bob decides there is only one person left he can possibly trust. He travels to the home of Sarah, the former girlfriend of his late friend Donnie. When a knock sounds at her door, Sarah opens it and immediately recognizes him. She knows exactly who he is. She has seen the news reports. She understands that the entire country is hunting him. Yet despite her fear, she hesitates only briefly before allowing him inside. The reason goes back years. Although Sarah had never personally met Bob before, she always knew about him through Donnie. Every year, flowers arrived in Donnie's memory, sent on Bob's behalf. Over time, that simple gesture convinced her that this was not the kind of man capable of the crimes being reported. Bob hands her a list of medical supplies he still needs. Without asking unnecessary questions, Sarah quietly helps him, obtaining medicine from various locations and assisting with his recovery. Meanwhile, FBI agent Nick Memphis continues investigating the case. The more evidence he reviews, the more uncomfortable he becomes. Something doesn't fit. The official explanation begins to feel increasingly suspicious. Questions start piling up in his mind. How could a sniper of Bob's caliber miss the president by such a large margin? Why would a professional assassin leave a rifle positioned so carelessly outside a window? Why do so many details seem staged? Determined to find answers, Nick attempts to question the nervous police officer Bob had noticed earlier. But before he can do so, shocking news arrives. The officer is dead. Authorities claim he committed suicide. Just like that, one of the most important witnesses in the entire case disappears, and another crucial piece of the puzzle is erased before anyone can uncover the truth. As the investigation continues, Agent Nick Memphis becomes increasingly obsessed with uncovering the truth. The official story no longer makes sense to him, and what started as routine casework gradually turns into a personal mission. At the same time, Bob's condition steadily improves thanks to Sarah's care. Day by day, he regains his strength. Once he is capable of moving around again, he tells Sarah that he wants to establish contact with Nick. To make that happen, Sarah secretly forwards the photograph of Colonel Johnson's vehicle to Nick. The photo serves a deeper purpose than simple evidence. Bob is testing him. If Nick destroys the photograph or ignores it, then he is just another loyal piece of the machine. But if he chooses to investigate, it will prove that he genuinely wants answers. Soon enough, Bob gets his answer. Nick begins digging into the photograph. From a distance, Bob carefully monitors everything and realizes that the young FBI agent is following the trail instead of burying it. Not long afterward, several officers arrive in the area to question people connected to the case. The situation quickly turns dangerous. As the officers begin reaching for their weapons, Bob reacts instantly. Without hesitation, he throws an iced coffee directly into one officer's face, momentarily blinding him. Using the confusion to his advantage, he grabs another man and uses him as cover before shoving him down a flight of stairs. A third federal agent attempts to intervene, but Bob disarms him, takes control of the weapon, and neutralizes the threat before making his escape. The following day, Colonel Johnson becomes alarmed. Nick's investigation has uncovered a troubling connection. The location where Bob was ambushed matches the location tied to the vehicle in the photograph. For Johnson, the conclusion is obvious. Bob and Nick have somehow found each other. That makes both of them dangerous. Meanwhile, Nick's independent investigation comes to an abrupt halt when he is kidnapped in broad daylight. The men who capture him show no mercy. He is beaten severely, and a fake suicide scene is carefully arranged around him. Using a specially designed brace and firearm setup, they intend to make his death appear self-inflicted. Everything is ready. Then Bob arrives. One by one, he takes out the men guarding the location and storms inside before they can finish the job. Within minutes, Nick is free. Afterward, Nick tries convincing Bob that they should trust the legal system and present their evidence through proper channels. But Bob doesn't share his optimism. He bluntly tells Nick that laws work only for ordinary citizens. The powerful figures responsible for this conspiracy operate beyond the reach of those laws. According to Bob, people like Johnson won't be stopped through paperwork in courtrooms. They require a different approach. And Bob has another reason for feeling that way. The conspirators have also killed his dog. At that point, the conflict has become deeply personal. Nick realizes that returning to his old life isn't as simple as walking back into FBI headquarters. Too much has happened, and too many people want the truth buried. Eventually, he decides to stand beside Bob. Together, they begin searching for the person who actually fired the fatal shot. Their investigation leads them to an elderly firearms specialist with extensive knowledge of long-range shooters. The expert explains that only a handful of marksmen on Earth possess the ability to accurately strike a target from roughly 3,000 meters away. Bob is one of them. Another works purely for money. The third is seriously injured and confined to a wheelchair. The moment Nick hears that description, something clicks in Bob's mind. He remembers a disabled advisor who was frequently seen alongside Johnson. Suddenly, a major piece of the puzzle falls into place. Using his contacts, Nick manages to track down the man's location. Preparing for what comes next, Bob and Nick purchase chemicals, metal pipes, and other materials from local stores. Back at their safe location, they assemble homemade explosives, including remote detonated charges and incendiary devices. Once everything is ready, they head for the disabled man's residence. The operation begins quietly. Nick eliminates the guards stationed outside without attracting attention. Inside the house, Bob deals with the remaining security personnel. Eventually, they reach the man they've been searching for. Faced with no way out, he finally reveals everything. The truth is far larger than either of them imagined. Johnson, he explains, is merely another piece on the board. The real architects of the conspiracy are operating from the shadows. He then reveals a horrifying secret. Approximately 2.5 years earlier, a powerful senator ordered the slaughter of hundreds of civilians in an entire village to clear the way for an oil pipeline project. The massacre was carefully concealed from the public. The assassination plot, the cover-up, and the framing of Bob were all designed to keep that atrocity hidden forever. Everything suddenly makes sense. Bob realizes his recruitment into the mission was never about protecting the president. It was about creating a convenient scapegoat. The archbishop who was killed had planned to expose the massacre during the president's upcoming speech. Because of that, he had to be silenced before he could speak. At last, the entire conspiracy stands exposed. But there is little time to celebrate. Outside, dozens of armed men begin surrounding the property. Every exit is covered. The disabled man finally understands the truth as well. Despite everything he knew, he was never truly important to the people pulling the strings. He was just another disposable asset. Realizing his fate, he looks toward Bob with trembling eyes. In a weak voice, he asks a simple question. "Are you going to kill me?" Before anyone can answer, he turns the gun on himself and pulls the trigger. His role in the story ends there. Now trapped inside a house under siege, Bob searches for a way out. A brutal firefight erupts. He takes down one attacker and becomes locked in a vicious hand-to-hand struggle with another. Outside, Nick activates one of the explosives. The blast throws the enemy forces into confusion. Using the chaos, Bob grabs an automatic rifle and pushes his way outdoors. Then comes the next surprise. He deploys an incendiary bomb. Flames erupt across the battlefield, spreading rapidly through the enemy positions. Several attackers are engulfed by the fire as panic sweeps through their ranks. Just when it seems the worst is over, a helicopter arrives overhead. Heavy gunfire rains down from the sky. The odds become overwhelming. Recognizing the danger, Nick deliberately exposes himself and draws the helicopter's attention. The aircraft immediately begins pursuing him. That distraction gives Bob exactly the opening he needs. In the distance sits a large oil tank. Bob shoulders his rifle, takes aim, and fires. Seconds later, a massive explosion tears through the area. The blast engulfs the helicopter, ripping it apart in midair. Debris scatters across the landscape as the aircraft crashes. Against all odds, Bob and Nick survive the encounter and escape. Now only one thing matters: Sarah's safety. To secure her release, Bob reaches out directly to Colonel Johnson. He offers a trade. In exchange for Sarah being left unharmed, he will hand over the recording containing the disabled man's confession. Johnson agrees. A meeting is arranged in the snow-covered mountains of Montana. The gathering includes not only Johnson but also Senator Mitchum, who acts as an intermediary between the two sides. As the appointed time arrives, Bob moves across the frozen landscape with his rifle in hand. From a distant ridge, he slowly advances toward the meeting point. Then a gunshot suddenly echoes through the mountains. Bob collapses into the snow. What nobody knows is that Johnson secretly positioned a sniper in advance. Watching from nearby, Senator Mitchum sees Bob fall and believes the problem has finally been solved. For the first time in a long while, he looks completely satisfied, convinced that the man threatening their secrets is dead at last. Just when it appears that everything is over, the situation takes a dramatic turn. A single gunshot echoes across the snowy mountains. The sniper hiding in the distance suddenly collapses with a perfectly placed shot to the head. At the same moment, Bob, who seemed to have been killed moments earlier, rises from the snow. The entire scenario had been carefully planned in advance. What looked like defeat was actually a trap. Nick had willingly put himself in danger by wearing a concealed steel plate beneath his clothing. The plan was simple but risky. If the enemy sniper believed he had a clear target and fired, the brief flash of the shot would reveal his position. The strategy works perfectly. The instant the sniper exposes himself, Bob identifies the location and eliminates him without hesitation. Before the remaining attackers can react, a second sniper is neutralized almost immediately. A third marksman manages to bring Bob into his sights and prepares to fire. However, he makes one tiny mistake. A faint reflection flashes from his scope lens. For an ordinary person, it would have gone unnoticed. For Bob, it is all the information he needs. A fraction of a second later, that sniper is down as well. With the hidden shooters eliminated, only one enemy remains, the man holding Sarah captive. This final shot requires absolute precision. Bob cannot afford the slightest error. He steadies himself, carefully aligns the target, and squeezes the trigger. The bullet strikes exactly where intended. The hostage-taker drops, and Sarah is finally free. Bob rushes toward her immediately. His intention is to keep the wounded man alive. A living witness could help expose the conspiracy and clear his name once and for all. But Sarah has reached her breaking point. Everything she has endured finally explodes into rage. Spotting a weapon nearby, she grabs it without hesitation and unloads the entire magazine into the man. Within seconds, the witness is dead. Not long afterward, an FBI helicopter arrives at the scene. Once again, the balance of power begins to shift. As the authorities move in, Bob reaches into his pocket and removes the recording device containing the disabled shooter's confession. For a moment, it seems like the evidence that could expose everything is finally about to come to light. Instead, Bob tosses it into the fire. The recording burns. By this point, he understands the consequences of releasing the information. The truth is no longer limited to a handful of corrupt individuals. The scandal could shake the entire nation. For Bob, the issue has grown beyond personal revenge. It has become tied to the reputation and stability of the country itself. While everyone is distracted, Colonel Johnson seizes the opportunity to flee aboard the helicopter. Bob, meanwhile, is taken into custody. Eventually, thanks largely to Nick's efforts, Bob receives a trial that is at least somewhat fair. The courtroom is packed. Government officials, attorneys, and investigators fill the room as tension hangs in the air. Before the proceedings begin, Nick approaches Bob and discreetly passes him a bullet during what appears to be nothing more than a handshake. The trial moves forward. Bob openly acknowledges that the rifle presented as evidence belongs to him. The admission immediately captures everyone's attention. Then he does something nobody expects. He inserts the bullet into the rifle and points the weapon directly toward Johnson. The reaction is instant. Fear flashes across Johnson's face. For the first time, he looks genuinely terrified. Bob pulls the trigger. Nothing happens. No gunshot, no recoil, silence. Then Bob calmly explains the reason. After every mission, he removes the firing pin from his rifle. Externally, the weapon appears completely functional. In reality, it cannot fire a single round. That revelation changes everything. If the rifle was incapable of shooting, then it could not possibly have been used in the assassination. The foundation of the case immediately begins to crumble. Following this, Nick presents additional evidence linking Johnson to the massacre carried out in the Ethiopian village years earlier. For a moment, it seems justice may finally prevail. But then, another reality emerges. The judge acknowledges the allegations but points out a legal obstacle. Because the massacre occurred outside the United States, the American court lacks jurisdiction to prosecute the crime. As a result, Johnson walks free. The verdict shocks many people in the room. Once again, the powerful escape punishment through technicalities and legal loopholes. Yet while others leave frustrated, Bob notices something hidden within the judge's remarks. Between the lines, he hears a message, and from that message, he understands exactly what he must do next. That same night, Johnson and Senator Mitchum gather to celebrate. Believing themselves untouchable, they drink, laugh, and enjoy their victory. To them, the nightmare is over. The people who suffered because of their actions are nothing more than forgotten memories. Then, the celebration abruptly ends. A bullet tears through the darkness and strikes Johnson in the throat. Chaos erupts. Johnson desperately scrambles for safety. He kills the lights and rushes outside, hoping to escape. The moment he reaches his vehicle, a massive explosion engulfs it. The blast destroys both the car and any hope of escape. Elsewhere on the property, Senator Mitchum searches frantically for a place to hide. Instead, he finds Bob waiting for him. Silent, calm, unstoppable. One security guard is eliminated instantly. A second is shot in the leg and collapses. Terrified, the wounded guard begins pleading for mercy. Bob remains unmoved. Moments later, that threat is gone as well. Now only the senator remains. Even faced with death, Mitchum attempts to rely on his status. Drawing himself up, he declares proudly, "I'm a United States Senator." Bob stares at him coldly. Then he delivers a simple response. Exactly. Those words carry all the judgment he needs. Without another warning, Bob fires at a nearby gas line. Gas rapidly fills the area. Seconds later, a violent explosion consumes everything. The corruption, the lies, the bloodshed, the people responsible, all of it disappears in a storm of fire. As the dust settles, the story reaches its final chapter. Far from the destruction, Sarah waits inside a parked vehicle. The road ahead is quiet. Eventually, Bob arrives. No speeches are necessary. No dramatic celebration follows. He simply gets into the car beside her. Together, they drive away. Behind them remains a world filled with betrayal, corruption, and power games. A world where standing against the system often comes at a terrible cost. Ahead of them lies something entirely different. A chance at peace. A chance at freedom. And perhaps, for the first time in a very long while, a chance to simply live. Let's be honest. Movies like Shooter don't usually show up in conversations about the greatest thrillers ever made. Nobody's putting it next to the all-time classics, and I don't think the film is trying to compete in that space anyway. What makes Shooter interesting is that it knows exactly what kind of movie it wants to be. It isn't chasing awards. It isn't trying to reinvent the action genre. It takes a pretty familiar setup. A skilled ex-military sniper, a government conspiracy, a man on the run, and builds an old-school action thriller around it. And honestly, that's probably why the movie has managed to stick around for so long. Because even if you've seen stories like this before, there's something oddly satisfying about the way Shooter delivers them. It gets into the conflict quickly, keeps the pressure on its main character, and rarely lets the story sit still for too long. One problem leads to another. Another betrayal is revealed, another chase begins, and before you know it, you're already an hour into the movie. Now that doesn't mean it's flawless. Even people who enjoy the film tend to agree that a lot of its twists are visible from a mile away. Some of the plot developments require a pretty generous suspension of disbelief. And if you're looking for a deeply layered political thriller with complex moral ambiguity, this probably isn't the movie that's going to satisfy that itch. But I also think judging Shooter solely on what it isn't misses the point. The reason many viewers continue to enjoy it is because it understands the appeal of a straightforward, revenge-driven conspiracy thriller. It gives you a capable protagonist, a group of powerful people pulling strings behind the scenes, and a situation where the odds seem completely impossible. From there, the film simply asks one question: how is this guy going to fight his way out of it? That's the hook. And for a lot of people, it's a hook that works surprisingly well. What's interesting is that reactions to the film tend to fall into two camps. Some viewers see it as a slick, entertaining action movie that delivers exactly what they signed up for. Others look at the familiar story beats, the larger-than-life heroics, and the political messaging and see something far less impressive. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. Because Shooter is neither a hidden masterpiece nor a disaster, it's one of those movies that succeeds largely because it commits to its identity. It knows its audience, it knows why people are watching. And instead of trying to become something bigger, smarter, or more important than it really is, it spends most of its time focusing on the things that brought people there in the first place: tension, action, conspiracies, and the satisfaction of watching a cornered man fight back. And that, more than anything else, explains why the film still has an audience all these years later. Before getting into the movie itself, I think it's worth talking about where Shooter actually came from, because a lot of people don't realize it wasn't originally written as a standalone action film. The movie is based on Stephen Hunter's novel Point of Impact, a book that already had a pretty strong reputation among thriller fans long before the film adaptation happened. And honestly, once you know that, certain parts of the movie start making a lot more sense. The detailed sniper discussions, the obsession with ballistics, the way the story keeps circling back to long-range shooting, military tactics, and investigative details. Those aren't things that feel randomly added for cool factor. They feel like elements that came from a writer who genuinely enjoyed that world. Now, like most adaptations, Shooter isn't trying to transfer every page of the novel directly onto the screen. It takes the core concept and reshapes it into something more accessible for a mainstream action audience. You can almost see the balancing act happening throughout the film. Part of it wants to be a conspiracy thriller built around military expertise and political corruption. The other part wants to be a crowd-pleasing action movie where things explode and bad people eventually get what's coming to them. And for better or worse, the movie usually leans toward the second option. The other major piece of the puzzle is Antoine Fuqua, who was sitting in an interesting place in his career when this film came out. By that point, Fuqua had already built a reputation for gritty, masculine action dramas. He wasn't really known for making lighthearted crowd-pleasers. Even when his films were commercial, they usually carried a rough edge to them. There's often a sense that his protagonists are trapped in situations that are bigger than they can control, and Shooters fits comfortably into that territory. You can actually feel some of his previous work bleeding into this movie. The isolated hero, the distrust of institutions, the atmosphere of people operating in moral gray areas. Those ideas show up here too, even if they're wrapped inside a much more straightforward action thriller package. What's interesting is that Shooter arrived during a period when audiences were really responding to this type of protagonist. The mid-2000s were full of highly skilled men being hunted by powerful organizations. You had spies, soldiers, assassins, government agents, basically a whole generation of movies built around one capable guy trying to survive against impossible odds. So in some ways, Shooter was stepping into an already crowded field. The challenge wasn't introducing something completely new. The challenge was finding a way to make audiences care about this version of the story. And that's where the sniper angle ended up becoming the film's biggest advantage. Because while the broader structure feels familiar, the emphasis on precision shooting, surveillance, long-distance engagement, and military expertise gives the movie its own personality. Even when the story starts moving into familiar territory, those details help separate it from a lot of other action thrillers released around the same period. So before we even get into Bob Lee Swagger himself, it's useful to understand what kind of movie we're dealing with here. This wasn't trying to be an art house political thriller. It wasn't trying to become a character study. And it wasn't chasing realism at every turn either. What it was trying to do was take the framework of a best-selling thriller novel, combine it with Antoine Fuqua's action sensibilities, and deliver a tense, audience-friendly ride built around one very dangerous man being pushed into a corner. Everything else in the movie pretty much grows from that foundation. So let's talk about Bob Lee Swagger, because the movie wastes absolutely no time telling you what kind of man this is. When we first meet him, he's not some loud action hero kicking down doors or delivering one-liners every 30 seconds. In fact, he's pretty much the opposite. He's living alone in the mountains, keeping to himself, far away from the institutions he once trusted. The only real company he seems interested in is his dog. And honestly, that little detail tells you a lot. This is somebody who has already checked out from the world long before the main story even begins. The reason becomes clear pretty quickly. Years earlier, Swagger was involved in a military operation that went catastrophically wrong. He and his spotter were left exposed during a mission, and while Swagger made it out alive, his partner didn't. It's the kind of event that doesn't just leave physical scars. It completely changes the way a person sees authority, loyalty, and the people giving orders from a safe distance. The movie doesn't spend forever dwelling on it, but it's important because everything Swagger does afterward is shaped by that experience, which makes what happens next almost ironic. Despite everything that's happened, despite all his distrust, despite choosing isolation over military life, he's still vulnerable to one thing, the belief that he can help prevent another tragedy. That's where Colonel Isaac Johnson enters the picture. Johnson approaches Swagger with what sounds like a serious national security concern. Intelligence suggests that someone may be planning to assassinate the president, and they need a sniper's perspective to figure out how such an attack could be carried out. Now here's the funny thing. The moment this proposal is introduced, most viewers immediately start getting suspicious. The setup practically invites suspicion. A retired sniper living off the grid suddenly gets approached by government officials asking for highly specialized help? Even if you've never seen this movie before, your instincts probably start working overtime. And to the film's credit, it doesn't really try to hide that feeling. The tension isn't coming from whether something is wrong. The tension comes from watching Swagger walk into it anyway. Because from his perspective, the mission makes sense. He's not being asked to pull a trigger. He's not being recruited to kill anyone. He's being asked to use his expertise to stop an attack. That's a very different proposition, so he agrees. What follows is actually one of the stronger parts of the setup because the movie takes time to show why Swagger is considered exceptional at what he does. He's not portrayed as some magical action figure with impossible abilities. At least not yet. He's methodical, analytical. Every location gets examined from angles most people would never even think about. Distance matters, wind matters, terrain matters, lines of sight matter. For a brief period, the movie almost feels like a procedural thriller. You're watching somebody apply years of experience to solve a problem, and those details help ground the story before things start escalating. And then everything falls apart. The event arrives. Shots are fired. Chaos erupts. Within minutes, the man who believed he was helping stop an assassination suddenly finds himself at the center of one. That's the moment where Shooter really locks into place. Up until then, the movie feels like it's building a mystery. After that, it becomes survival. The setup is actually pretty simple when you strip everything else away. A highly skilled man is manipulated into becoming the perfect fall guy. The people responsible have resources, influence, and power on their side. He has almost nothing, no army, no badge, no political protection. Just his training, his instincts, and the growing realization that he has walked directly into a trap designed long before he ever arrived. And whether the audience completely buys every detail of that setup or not, it's undeniably effective at creating momentum. Once Swagger is forced into that position, the movie rarely slows down again. From that point forward, it stops being about preventing a crime. It becomes about surviving one. Once Swagger realizes he's been set up, Shooters basically transforms into a completely different movie. The first act is about preparation. The second act is about survival. And honestly, that's where the film finds its rhythm. What I find interesting is that the movie doesn't spend much time trying to convince us that the conspiracy exists. It almost assumes you've already accepted it. The real focus becomes watching one man try to navigate a situation where every institution that should be helping him is suddenly working against him. Police want him. Federal agencies want him. The people who framed him want him dead. Even the evidence seems to be cooperating against him. That's actually one of the reasons the story stays engaging even when some of the plot turns become a little predictable. The movie constantly keeps Swagger moving. Every time it feels like he's found a safe place to breathe, something happens and he has to adapt again. A new lead appears. A new threat emerges. Somebody gets too close. Somebody gets killed. The pressure never completely disappears, and that creates a pretty effective sense of momentum. The funny thing is, on paper, this is a story we've all seen before. The wrongly accused hero isn't exactly a revolutionary concept. Hollywood has been making variations of this setup for decades. But what Shooter understands is that these stories aren't really about innocence. They're about isolation. The moment Swagger becomes the target, he's cut off from everything. Nobody is waiting to hear his side of the story. Nobody is interested in fairness. The machine has already decided what happened, and now he's forced to operate outside of it. That feeling shows up repeatedly throughout the movie. Sometimes it works because of action scenes. Sometimes it works because of paranoia. Sometimes it works because you start wondering how anyone could realistically escape a situation like this. Of course, the answer is that most people couldn't. Swagger isn't most people, and the film never lets you forget that. Every problem eventually becomes another opportunity for him to demonstrate just how capable he is. Whether he's tracking people, planning escapes, reading situations before everyone else, or finding ways to stay one step ahead, the movie is constantly reinforcing the idea that this is somebody whose skills make him uniquely dangerous. For some viewers, that's part of the fun. For others, that's where the movie starts stretching credibility. But regardless of where you fall on that debate, it's difficult to deny that the narrative always knows what its objective is. Clear his name, expose the people responsible, stay alive long enough to do both. Everything else branches out from those three goals. One thing I appreciated during this portion of the film is that Swagger isn't entirely alone. The story gradually introduces people who begin noticing that the official version of events doesn't quite add up. And that's important because without those characters, the movie risks becoming a one-man show for 2 straight hours. Instead, we get small investigations happening alongside Swagger's own mission. Pieces start connecting. Questions begin surfacing. The cracks in the conspiracy slowly become visible. Not all of these developments are subtle. Some are actually pretty obvious, but they help prevent the story from becoming repetitive. The movie keeps alternating between pursuit and discovery. Run, hide, investigate, fight back, repeat. It's a formula, sure, but it's an effective one, and I think that's what best describes the core narrative of Shooter. The film isn't trying to overwhelm the audience with complexity. Despite the political conspiracies and government cover-ups, the emotional through-line remains surprisingly simple. A man has been betrayed, blamed for something he didn't do, and pushed into a corner by people who believe they're untouchable. The entire movie is built around watching what happens when that man decides he isn't going to stay there. That's really the engine driving everything forward, not the politics, not the mystery, not even the conspiracy itself. It's the constant feeling that Swagger is hunting for the truth while being hunted at the exact same time. And for most of the movie, that balancing act works pretty well. One thing that becomes impossible to ignore once Shooter gets rolling is just how much of the movie is built around distrust. Not just distrust of a particular character, distrust of systems, distrust of institutions, distrust of people operating behind closed doors, and depending on your perspective, that's either one of the movie's biggest strengths or one of the reasons it occasionally loses its footing, because the conspiracy at the center of Shooter isn't small. This isn't a story where one corrupt official is secretly pulling strings. The movie keeps widening the circle. At first it feels like Swagger has been betrayed by a handful of individuals. Then more names appear. More connections surface. Suddenly you're dealing with military figures, intelligence agencies, politicians, powerful businessmen, and people who seem capable of rewriting reality whenever it becomes convenient. The deeper Swagger digs, the bigger the machine becomes. And I think that's intentional. The film wants the audience to feel overwhelmed by the scale of it all. It wants you to look at the situation and think, how exactly is one guy supposed to beat this? That's where a lot of the tension comes from. Not necessarily whether the conspiracy is believable, but whether it's survivable. What's interesting is that Shooter never really presents these powerful figures as cartoon masterminds sitting around plotting world domination. Their motivations are usually much more familiar than that. Money, influence, protection, self-preservation. The movie keeps returning to the idea that power protects itself. Once people reach a certain level, the rules start bending around them. Evidence disappears, stories get rewritten, convenient explanations appear out of nowhere. Whether viewers buy into that idea is another conversation entirely. Some people watch the film and see a sharp criticism of political corruption and unchecked authority. Others see it as a conspiracy thriller that occasionally gets carried away with its own suspicions. Honestly, I can understand both reactions. There were moments where I found the political angle genuinely interesting because it gave the story something bigger than a simple revenge plot. Without those elements, Shooter probably becomes just another action movie about a wronged ex-soldier. At the same time, there are scenes where the movie feels so determined to emphasize corruption that it almost starts stacking the deck too heavily. Every new revelation seems to confirm that somebody else is compromised, somebody else is lying, somebody else is benefiting from the chaos. After a while, you stop wondering if corruption exists and start wondering whether anyone in this universe isn't corrupt, and that's where audience reactions tend to split. If you're someone who enjoys conspiracy thrillers, this is probably part of the appeal. The movie constantly rewards suspicion. Every conversation feels loaded. Every official explanation feels questionable. Every powerful figure becomes a potential suspect. There's a certain entertainment value in that. You start looking at characters differently. You start questioning motives. You start expecting betrayals before they happen. The film creates an atmosphere where trust feels almost reckless. But if you're looking for a more grounded political thriller, the scale of the conspiracy can occasionally feel a little fuzzy around the edges. There are moments where the network of corruption becomes so large that the specifics start mattering less than the general idea, and strangely enough, that doesn't completely hurt the movie. Because Shooter isn't really interested in turning its conspiracy into a complex puzzle that audiences have to solve piece by piece. The conspiracy functions more like an obstacle course. Every layer exists to place another barrier between Swagger and the truth. Every secret creates another enemy. Every cover-up gives him another reason to keep pushing forward. In that sense, the conspiracy isn't the destination, it's the fuel. It's what keeps the story moving. It's what turns a framed sniper into a hunted man. And it's what transforms the movie from a straightforward action thriller into something that occasionally brushes against political paranoia, even if it never fully commits to becoming a serious political drama. That's probably why the conspiracy element remains one of the most memorable parts of Shooter. Not because it's always subtle, not because it's always believable, but because it creates a world where the hero isn't just fighting individuals anymore. He's fighting a system that seems designed to make the truth disappear. And that's a much more intimidating enemy than any single villain could ever be. The thing about Shooter is that it only works if Bob Lee Swagger works. You can have all the conspiracies you want. You could have government cover-ups, political corruption, assassinations, explosions, secret meetings in dark rooms. None of that really matters if the audience doesn't care about the guy caught in the middle of it. Fortunately for the movie, Swagger is probably its strongest asset. Not because he's the deepest character ever written. He's not. Not because he's endlessly complex. He isn't. What makes him work is actually much simpler than that. You understand him almost immediately. Before the conspiracy starts, before the chase begins, before anyone is framed, the movie introduces a man who has already lost faith in the people he once trusted. He's carrying around old wounds, some visible, some not. He's isolated himself from society, lives far away from everyone else, and clearly has no interest in becoming a hero again. And honestly, that part feels surprisingly relatable. Not the sniper part, obviously. The exhaustion part, the feeling of being done with something you once believed in, that lands. One thing I noticed while watching is that Swagger isn't motivated by ambition. He isn't chasing power. He isn't trying to save the world. He isn't even looking for revenge at first. He mostly wants to be left alone. Which is probably why it's easy to sympathize with him when everything starts falling apart. The movie keeps throwing him into situations he never asked for. Every disaster can be traced back to the moment he decided to trust the wrong people. And there's something frustrating about that in a good way. You watch him make what seems like a reasonable decision, and then spend the next 2 hours paying for it. That creates investment almost automatically, because even when the movie starts stretching credibility, the emotional foundation remains clear. He didn't create this mess. He got dragged into it. That's an important distinction. A lot of action heroes actively choose danger. Swagger feels more like someone who keeps having danger forced onto him until eventually he decides he's had enough. And once that switch flips, the movie changes. You can actually feel it happen. Early on, he's reacting. Later, he's hunting. At first, he's trying to survive. Then, he's trying to expose the people responsible. Then, eventually, he wants something even more personal than that. The evolution is straightforward, but it works because the audience has already spent enough time with him to understand why he's changing. Now, does the movie occasionally turn him into a superhero? Absolutely. There are moments where Swagger survives things that would probably end most people's stories immediately. There are scenes where his skills seem almost limitless. He's a sniper, a tracker, a strategist, a survival expert, a medic, a weapons specialist. At certain points, it feels like if you left him alone in the wilderness for a weekend, he'd return with a satellite program and a functioning power grid. The film definitely leans into the myth of Bob Lee Swagger. But strangely, that's part of the appeal. Because Shooter understands that audiences don't necessarily come to a movie like this looking for an average person. They want somebody exceptional. They want the feeling that every powerful person in the room has underestimated the wrong guy. Swagger embodies that fantasy almost perfectly. The people framing him think they're dealing with a witness. They're actually dealing with a weapon. And the movie has a lot of fun exploring that idea. What helps keep the character from becoming completely detached from reality is that his pain never really disappears. Underneath all the action scenes, he's still carrying guilt from the mission that destroyed his old life. He's still dealing with betrayal. He's still operating from a place of loss. The movie never dives deeply into those emotions, but they're present enough that they give him weight. Without them, he'd probably just be another action figure with a rifle. Instead, he feels like a man whose abilities are constantly colliding with his resentment, his grief, and his inability to let injustice go. That's why viewers tend to stay on his side even when the movie becomes larger than life. You don't necessarily believe everything he does. You believe why he's doing it, and honestly, that's usually more important. By the time the story reaches its later stages, most people aren't watching because they're fascinated by the conspiracy anymore. They're watching because they want to see Bob Lee Swagger win. They want him to survive. They want him to expose the truth. And maybe, just maybe, they want him to make a few very bad people regret ever crossing him in the first place. That's the real achievement of the character. Not that he's realistic, not that he's complicated. It's that the movie convinces you to root for him almost from the moment he appears on screen, and it never really loses that connection. For a movie that revolves so heavily around Bob Lee Swagger, Shooter actually depends quite a bit on its supporting cast. Because let's be honest, if this were just 2 straight hours of Mark Wahlberg running through forests, dodging bullets, and staring through rifle scopes, the movie would probably get old pretty quickly. The people around him matter. Some more than others, admittedly. The most important supporting character is probably Nick Memphis, the rookie FBI agent played by Michael Pena. And honestly, every time I revisit the film, I end up appreciating this character a little more. Because while Swagger is operating at almost mythical action hero levels, Memphis feels like an actual person. He's not the smartest guy in the room. He's not some elite investigator who immediately cracks the case. He's just somebody who notices that certain things don't add up. That's it. And that simple curiosity gradually pulls him deeper into the mess. I like that the movie doesn't make him instantly competent at everything. He stumbles, he makes mistakes. Sometimes he looks completely overwhelmed by what's happening around him, which, frankly, is probably how most of us would react if we suddenly found ourselves uncovering a massive conspiracy. His role becomes really important because he gives the audience another perspective on the story. Through Swagger, we see the conspiracy from the outside. Through Memphis, we see how the system itself starts cracking when someone inside begins asking questions. And Pena brings a certain nervous energy to the role that helps balance the film. Without him, Shooter risks becoming a little too serious all the time. Then there's Sarah Fenn, played by Kate Mara. Sarah occupies a somewhat complicated place in the movie. On one hand, she serves an important emotional function. She's connected to Swagger's past through the loss of his former spotter, which means every interaction between them carries a layer of shared grief underneath it. The film clearly wants her presence to humanize Swagger, to remind us there's still a person underneath all the survival skills and tactical expertise. Sometimes that works. Other times it feels like the movie isn't entirely sure what to do with her. There are moments where she seems poised to become a major part of the story, and then the narrative shifts back toward the conspiracy and action sequences. It's one of those situations where the character feels more significant emotionally than she does narratively. Still, Kate Mara brings enough sincerity to the role that it never becomes distracting. Now let's talk about Colonel Isaac Johnson. Because every conspiracy thriller needs somebody who immediately sets off alarm bells the moment they appear on screen, and Johnson definitely qualifies. The funny thing is that the movie never really tries to make him seem harmless. From the second he enters the story, there's an underlying sense that something feels off, not enough to ruin the plot, just enough to create tension. Danny Glover plays him with a calm confidence that works surprisingly well. He's not screaming threats or acting like a traditional movie villain. Most of the time, he's composed, polite even, which somehow makes him more unsettling. You get the feeling he's used to operating in environments where consequences simply don't apply to him anymore. Then you have Senator Meacham and the other political figures floating around the edges of the conspiracy. They're less developed as individual characters and more representative of the larger forces working against Swagger. That's not necessarily a criticism. The movie isn't trying to tell deeply personal stories about these people. They're obstacles, powerful obstacles. The faces attached to a system that keeps protecting itself, and for the most part, that's enough. One thing I noticed while revisiting the movie is that a lot of the supporting characters aren't really there to compete with Swagger for attention. Their job is to illuminate different parts of the story. Memphis helps expose the truth. Sarah connects us to Swagger's emotional side. Johnson represents corruption and betrayal. The politicians represent institutional power. Everyone serves a purpose. Whether they're fully developed is another question. In fact, that's probably one of the movie's biggest limitations when it comes to its supporting cast. A few characters feel like they exist primarily to move the plot forward rather than exist as complete people. You notice it occasionally. Some relationships could have been explored further. Some motivations could have been given more room to breathe. A few characters arrive, make an impact, and disappear before the audience has much time to connect with them. But strangely, that never becomes a major problem. Mostly because Shooter understands where its center of gravity is. This is Bob Lee Swagger's story. Everyone else is orbiting around him. The supporting cast isn't trying to steal the movie. They're helping build the world around the main character and giving him people to trust, people to fear, and people to fight against. And for an action thriller like this, that's usually enough. Not every supporting character is unforgettable. Not every subplot gets fully explored. But together they create just enough texture that the movie feels bigger than a simple one-man revenge fantasy. And that's probably why they work. One thing I kept thinking about while watching Shooter is that this movie is much more interested in momentum than transformation, and I don't necessarily mean that as a criticism, it's just an observation. A lot of thrillers like this are built around characters changing dramatically over the course of the story. They learn something about themselves, their worldview shifts, relationships evolve. By the end, they're fundamentally different people than they were at the beginning. Shooter doesn't really operate that way. Bob Lee Swagger starts the movie as a man who distrusts powerful institutions, carries emotional scars from his military past, and believes loyalty is something that gets abused by people in charge. Then, the plot spends 2 hours proving him right. So, instead of changing him, the story mostly reinforces who he already is. That's actually kind of interesting when you think about it. The movie isn't asking, who will Swagger become? It's asking, what happens when a man like Swagger gets pushed too far? Those are very different questions, and because of that, character development here tends to happen in smaller ways. You see it in how he reacts to people. You see it in how he slowly allows himself to trust certain individuals again. You see it in the moments where his mission stops being about survival and starts becoming something more personal. They're subtle shifts rather than major transformations. Some viewers will appreciate that. Others might wish the movie dug deeper. Personally, I found myself somewhere in the middle, because there are moments where Shooter hints at richer character material than it ultimately explores. Swagger's guilt over his fallen partner, his complicated relationship with patriotism, his resentment toward the institutions that abandoned him. Those are fascinating ideas. The movie touches them, sometimes effectively, but it rarely stays with them for very long. Usually because another chase scene, another shootout, or another conspiracy revelation is waiting around the corner, and that's really the balancing act the film struggles with. Every time it gets close to slowing down and examining its characters more closely, it remembers it's an action thriller and immediately starts moving again. Nowhere is that more noticeable than in the relationships. Take Sarah, for example. The emotional connection between her and Swagger makes sense on paper. They're both carrying the weight of the same loss. They both have reasons to distrust the people responsible for what happened. There are moments where the movie seems interested in exploring that shared grief. Then suddenly, we're back to rifles, investigations, and people getting chased through forests. It's not that the relationship feels forced, it's more that it feels unfinished, like the movie sketches the outline of something meaningful and then gets distracted by everything else happening around it. The same thing happens with several supporting characters. Nick Memphis probably comes closest to having a genuine arc. He starts off as someone following procedures, trusting the system, and doing his job. Gradually, he begins realizing that reality is messier than the official story he's being given. There's actual growth there, not huge growth, but enough to make his role feel important beyond simply helping the protagonist. What's interesting is that despite these limitations, the characters remain surprisingly watchable. And I think that's because the movie understands a basic truth about action thrillers. Development and likability aren't always the same thing. You can enjoy spending time with a character even if they're not especially layered. You can root for someone even if their internal journey isn't particularly complex. Swagger benefits enormously from that. He's competent, he's determined, he's wronged. That's a powerful combination in the genre. Audiences naturally gravitate toward characters who are fighting impossible odds, especially when those odds feel unfair. The downside is that everyone else occasionally ends up existing in his shadow. The supporting cast often functions more as extensions of the plot than fully realized individuals with lives outside the story. The villains represent corruption. The allies represent trust. The politicians represent power. The institutions represent betrayal. Everybody serves a purpose. Not everybody gets depth. And that's probably the clearest way to describe the character writing in Shooter overall. It's effective. It's functional. Sometimes it's even surprisingly compelling. But the film almost always prioritizes forward momentum over emotional exploration. When given the choice between stopping for character development or launching into the next stage of the conspiracy, Shooters chooses the conspiracy nearly every time. Whether that's a weakness or simply the nature of the genre depends on what you're looking for. For me, it left the movie feeling like it had a little more beneath the surface than people often give it credit for, but not quite enough interest in slowing down to fully uncover it. If there's one thing that helps Shooters stay entertaining even when the plot starts stretching reality a little too far, it's the cast. Because let's face it, a movie like this lives or dies on whether you believe the people on screen. You don't necessarily have to believe every conspiracy. You don't have to believe every escape. You definitely don't have to believe every injury Swagger somehow walks away from. But you do need to believe the characters believe it. And for the most part, the actors manage to sell it. Starting with Mark Wahlberg, this feels like one of those roles that fits him almost perfectly. Not because it's particularly demanding from a dramatic standpoint, it isn't, but because the character plays directly into a lot of Wahlberg's strengths as a screen presence. Swagger isn't somebody who delivers long emotional speeches. He isn't charming his way through situations. He isn't cracking jokes every 5 minutes. He's quiet, reserved, a little stubborn. The kind of guy who always looks like he's carrying around a conversation he never finished years ago. Wahlberg has always been surprisingly effective at playing those types of characters. There's a natural toughness to him that doesn't feel manufactured. Even when he's standing still, you get the sense that he's evaluating everything around him. That works incredibly well for a sniper character. What's interesting is that the movie never asks him to be larger than life emotionally, even though the story often turns him into a larger than life action hero physically. His performance stays relatively grounded while the movie itself becomes increasingly outrageous. And honestly, that balance helps. Because if Wahlberg had played Swagger with constant swagger, no pun intended, the character probably would have become exhausting. Instead, he keeps him restrained. Sometimes almost too restrained. There are moments where he mumbles through dialogue so casually that you find yourself leaning in a little harder to catch what he just said. But weirdly enough, it fits the character. Then there's Michael Pena. And every time I watch this movie, I find myself liking his performance more. Partly because he feels like he's in a slightly different movie than everyone else. While Swagger is surviving impossible situations and uncovering giant conspiracies, Pena is playing a guy who genuinely seems confused about how he ended up involved in all of this. That energy works. His reactions often feel more human than everyone else's. He asks questions. He hesitates. He second-guesses himself. He's not operating with the certainty that most action thriller characters seem to possess, and because of that, Nick Memphis becomes one of the easiest characters to connect with. You need someone like that in a movie filled with elite soldiers, corrupt politicians, and shadowy government figures. Pena gives the story a little humanity. Now, Danny Glover is an interesting case, because depending on how familiar you are with his career, there can be something slightly strange about seeing him on this side of the conflict. For years, he was one of those actors audiences naturally trusted. You saw Danny Glover appear in a movie, and your brain automatically categorized him as somebody dependable. Shooter takes advantage of that, at least initially. Once his true role becomes clear, Glover leans into it without becoming cartoonish. He doesn't choose scenery. He doesn't spend half the movie screaming threats. Instead, he plays Johnson with a calm confidence that feels almost bureaucratic, like a man who's convinced he's untouchable. That's often more effective than traditional villainy. The same goes for Ned Beatty. He's not given a huge amount of screen time, but he understands exactly what kind of movie he's in. He brings a certain weariness and arrogance to his role that fits the film's cynical view of power. You immediately understand what kind of person you're dealing with. No lengthy explanations required. Kate Mara probably has the toughest assignment among the major cast members. Not because she's bad, far from it. The challenge is that her character often feels caught between two different versions of the movie. One version wants her to be an important emotional anchor for Swagger. The other wants to keep sprinting toward the next action sequence. As a result, she doesn't always get the material she deserves. Still, she brings sincerity to the role, and that matters. You never doubt the emotional reality of her scenes, even when the movie moves past them quickly. And then there are all the supporting players scattered throughout the conspiracy. The politicians, the military figures, the investigators, the various people who either help Swagger or try to eliminate him. Most of them aren't especially complex characters, but they don't need to be. Their job is to make the world feel populated by people with competing interests and hidden motives. They accomplish that. What I appreciate most about the performances overall is that nobody seems embarrassed by the material. That's more important than it sounds. Action thrillers can fall apart when actors start treating the story like it's beneath them. You can feel the detachment, the lack of commitment. That never really happens here. Everyone approaches the material seriously, even when the plot occasionally wanders into implausible territory. And that commitment helps hold the entire movie together. Because when you strip away all the explosions, the conspiracies, the sniper rifles, and the revenge fantasy elements, Shooter is still asking the audience to spend 2 hours with these people. The reason that's easy to do is because the cast consistently gives the movie more credibility than the script sometimes earns on its own. Not every performance is memorable. Not every character is deeply layered, but collectively, the cast does exactly what this kind of movie needs them to do. They make the story feel real enough that you stop questioning it and start enjoying the ride. One of the reasons Shooters still has a following all these years later has very little to do with the conspiracy plot. It's the sniper stuff, seriously. Ask people what they remember most about this movie, and a surprising number of them won't start with the political corruption or the revenge angle. They'll start talking about the rifles, the long-distance shots, the calculations, the tactics, and all the little details surrounding how a sniper operates. And I kinda get it. There's always been something fascinating about sniper characters in movies. Maybe it's because they're usually portrayed differently from traditional action heroes. Most action protagonists solve problems by running directly toward danger. Snipers do the opposite. They slow everything down. They observe. They calculate. They wait. There's something inherently cinematic about that. A gunfight can last 30 seconds. A sniper shot can build tension for 5 minutes before anything actually happens. The movie understands this pretty well. In fact, some of the most memorable moments aren't action scenes at all. They're conversations about shooting, discussions about distance, wind, elevation, positioning, tiny details that most people would never think about. And honestly, that's where Shooter feels most confident. It genuinely seems interested in the craft, not just the result, the process. A lot of movies treat sniping as magic. Somebody looks through a scope, pulls a trigger, and hits a target from an impossible distance because the script says so. Shooter at least tries to create the impression that there's real expertise involved. The movie spends time explaining that successful long-range shooting isn't just about aiming accurately. It's about understanding conditions, reading terrain, anticipating movement, accounting for factors most people wouldn't even notice. Whether every technical detail is perfectly accurate isn't really the point. The point is that the movie respects the skill enough to make it feel specialized, and that goes a long way. One detail I appreciated is the attention given to the relationship between a sniper and a spotter. A lot of films ignore that entirely. Here, the spotter isn't treated as background decoration. The movie repeatedly reinforces how important that partnership is. It's one of the few times an action film actually gives viewers a glimpse into the teamwork behind long-range shooting, rather than presenting the sniper as a lone genius who does everything himself. That may sound like a small thing, but it adds credibility. It makes the world feel lived in. At the same time, the movie definitely enjoys building the mythology of Bob Lee Swagger, and that's where things get interesting, because there are really two versions of Swagger operating throughout the film. There's the trained military professional, then there's the legend. The first version feels grounded. The second version feels like the kind of person action movies love creating. The guy who can survive impossible situations. The guy who can outthink entire organizations. The guy who always seems 3 steps ahead of everyone else. The movie constantly moves back and forth between those versions. Sometimes you're watching a highly skilled marksman applying years of training. Other times you're watching what feels like a modern folk hero with a rifle. Strangely, both versions work. Partly because the film never loses sight of the details that make Swagger's expertise believable. Even when the action becomes exaggerated, the tactical side often remains convincing enough to keep the audience invested. And that's important because the military elements aren't just decoration here. They're tied directly into the character. Swagger doesn't win because he's stronger than everyone else. He wins because he sees situations differently. He notices things other people miss. He plans ahead. He adapts. The movie repeatedly frames intelligence and preparation as weapons every bit as valuable as firearms. That's a nice touch. Now, if you're someone with extensive military knowledge, you'll probably spot things that don't quite hold up under scrutiny. No action movie escapes that problem. There are definitely moments where Hollywood takes over. Certain escapes become a little too convenient. Certain feats become a little too impressive. Certain situations seem designed more for entertainment than realism. But honestly, I never felt like Shooter was trying to become a military documentary. It's trying to create the illusion of authenticity while still delivering a crowd-pleasing thriller. And for the most part, it succeeds. What I find most interesting is that the sniper material ends up giving the movie an identity beyond its plot. Strip away the rifles and tactical expertise, and Shooter becomes a fairly familiar story about a wrongfully accused man uncovering a conspiracy. Keep those elements, though, and suddenly it has a personality. It has a specific flavor. You remember the calculations. You remember the discussions about trajectory and distance. You remember the attention paid to preparation. You remember the feeling that every shot carries consequences. That's probably why the sniper aspect remains one of the film's strongest features. Not because it's always realistic, not because it's always accurate, but because it gives the movie something a lot of action thrillers struggle to find: a unique obsession. And whenever Shooter leans into that obsession, it's usually at its most interesting. Let's be honest for a second. Nobody sits down to watch Shooter because they're hoping for a deep philosophical discussion about government institutions. People watch Shooter because they want to see a highly trained sniper get framed, survive impossible odds, and eventually make life very uncomfortable for the people responsible. And thankfully, the movie understands that. One thing I noticed almost immediately is that Shooter has a pretty good sense of when to speed up and when to hold back. A lot of action movies make the mistake of throwing explosions at the audience every 10 minutes and hoping that somehow creates excitement. It usually doesn't. After a while, non-stop action just becomes background noise. Shooter avoids that trap more often than not because it realizes suspense and action aren't the same thing. Some of the most effective sequences in the movie happen before anyone even fires a shot. It's the anticipation, the waiting, the feeling that something is about to happen but you don't know exactly when. Those moments matter, especially in a movie built around a sniper. The entire concept of sniping is rooted in patience, observation, timing. The film occasionally taps into that mindset, and whenever it does, the tension becomes much stronger than the action itself. Then, when things finally explode, sometimes, literally, it feels earned. What I like about the action scenes is that they generally have a purpose. They're not just random interruptions. Most of them are connected directly to Swagger's situation. He's escaping, he's defending himself, he's trying to uncover information, he's eliminating obstacles. The action keeps pushing the story forward rather than stopping it. That's a small thing, but it makes a difference. Because there's nothing worse than a movie that pauses its narrative every 20 minutes for an action sequence that could be removed without changing anything. Here, the action and the plot are usually moving together. Another thing that works surprisingly well is the chase aspect of the movie. For a large portion of its runtime, Shooter functions almost like a manhunt thriller. Swagger isn't hunting people yet, he's being hunted, and there's an important difference. That shift automatically creates tension because the audience is constantly wondering how long he can stay ahead. Every safe location feels temporary, every ally feels vulnerable, every conversation carries risk. Even when the movie starts leaning into some larger-than-life heroics, that pressure never completely disappears. The sense of pursuit keeps things moving. Now, does the film occasionally get ridiculous? Absolutely. There are moments where Swagger survives situations that feel, let's just say, highly optimistic. Moments where the odds become so stacked against him that you start thinking, okay, this guy is either incredibly skilled or the luckiest human being on Earth. Probably both. But weirdly enough, that doesn't hurt the movie as much as it could have. Because the action is staged with enough confidence that you often stop questioning it and just go along for the ride. That's one of Antoine Fuqua's strengths as a director. Even when something stretches credibility, he usually presents it with enough conviction that it remains entertaining. The shootouts themselves are also handled pretty well. They're not always massive. Not every confrontation turns into complete chaos. Some are quick, some are brutal. Some are built entirely around positioning and preparation rather than sheer firepower. That variety helps. The movie rarely falls into a repetitive rhythm where every action scene feels identical to the last one. And then there's the violence. Shooter isn't particularly shy about it. When people get shot, they generally stay shot. The film wants its action to feel impactful, sometimes messy, sometimes uncomfortable. There's a weight to certain moments that prevents the movie from becoming completely cartoonish, even when the story itself starts drifting toward action fantasy territory. What's interesting is that the suspense often outperforms the action, not because the action is bad, far from it, but because the movie becomes genuinely engaging whenever Swagger is forced to outthink people rather than simply outshoot them. Those are the moments where the film feels most alive. Watching him analyze situations, watching him anticipate moves, watching him stay one step ahead, that's where the tension really comes from. The rifle is important. The intelligence behind the rifle is even more important, and that's why I think the action works as well as it does. It's not just about watching things blow up. It's about watching a character use every skill he has to survive a situation that keeps getting worse. The explosions, the shootouts, the chases, they're all part of that. But underneath all of it is a very simple source of suspense. Can this guy stay alive long enough to prove he's right? That question keeps hanging over almost every major sequence in the movie. And even when you think you know the answer, Shooter does a pretty good job making the journey entertaining enough that you want to keep watching anyway. The more I think about Shooter, the more I realize this is one of those movies where the directing does a lot of heavy lifting. Because if you break the story down on paper, it's not exactly revolutionary. A betrayed military veteran, a government conspiracy, a man on the run, corrupt officials, a revenge mission. We've seen versions of this story countless times. The reason Shooter stays engaging for as long as it does has a lot to do with how Antoine Fuqua presents it. One thing Fuqua has always been good at is making competence look interesting. That sounds simple, but it really isn't. A lot of directors struggle with this. They'll tell you a character is highly skilled, but they never actually show it in a convincing way. The audience is expected to accept it because the script says so. Fuqua tends to approach things differently. He likes showing process. Preparation. Observation. Small details. Throughout Shooter, there are moments where Swagger is simply studying a location, calculating a shot, examining evidence, or planning his next move. None of these moments should be particularly exciting on their own, yet somehow they usually are. That's directing. The film understands that tension doesn't always come from movement. Sometimes it comes from watching somebody think. Another thing I noticed is that Fuqua rarely allows the movie to sit still for very long, not in an exhausting way, just enough to keep the story feeling alive. The film is constantly transitioning between different modes. One minute it's a conspiracy thriller, then it becomes a fugitive story, then it's an investigation, then suddenly it's an action sequence. That variety helps a lot, because the movie could have easily become repetitive. Instead, it keeps changing shape just enough that you stay engaged. Now, does every scene work perfectly? Not really. There are definitely moments where the movie moves so quickly that certain characters or relationships don't get the attention they probably deserve. You occasionally get the feeling that a scene exists mainly because the plot needs to reach the next destination. And that's where some of the filmmaking feels a little mechanical. Not bad, just practical. Like the movie is always aware that it has somewhere else to be. The editing plays a big role in that. For the most part, Shooter is cut together with a pretty clear sense of momentum. Information is delivered efficiently. Scenes rarely overstay their welcome. The film generally knows when to move on. That's one reason the 2-hour runtime doesn't feel as long as it actually is. Even when the plot becomes complicated, the movie remains surprisingly easy to follow. And trust me, with conspiracy thrillers, that's not always the case. Some films in this genre become so obsessed with twists, hidden agendas, and political intrigue that eventually nobody knows what's happening anymore. Shooter occasionally flirts with that danger, but the filmmaking keeps things relatively clear. You always understand who Swagger is chasing. You always understand who's chasing him, and you always understand what he wants. That clarity matters. One area where Fuqua deserves credit is restraint, which sounds strange considering how many explosions are in this movie. But hear me out. There are plenty of opportunities where the film could have become completely ridiculous. Moments where it could have pushed the action into full comic book territory. Instead, Fuqua usually keeps one foot planted in reality. Not perfect reality, Hollywood reality, but still reality. Even the bigger action scenes often feel grounded by physical environments, practical obstacles, and genuine consequences. The movie wants you to believe these events could almost happen, almost being the key word. What's interesting is that you can sometimes see Fuqua's priorities as a filmmaker peeking through. He's clearly more interested in pressure than mystery, more interested in pursuit than investigation, more interested in conflict than conversation. Whenever the movie has a choice between slowing down to explain something or pushing forward into tension, it almost always chooses tension. That's not necessarily a flaw. It's just the movie understanding its own identity. And honestly, that's something I appreciate more now than I did years ago. A lot of action thrillers get distracted trying to be everything at once. Political commentary, character study, mystery, action spectacle, social critique. Shooter occasionally touches on some of those things, but Fuqua never loses sight of the fact that he's making an audience-focused thriller. The primary goal is engagement. Keep people watching. Keep them invested. Keep them wondering what happens next. And from a filmmaking perspective, that's probably where the movie succeeds most. Not because every directorial choice is brilliant, not because every scene is memorable, but because the film is constantly moving with purpose. Even when the story stumbles, even when the conspiracy becomes messy, even when certain plot developments require a leap of faith, the filmmaking keeps pulling you forward. By the time one scene ends, you're already interested in the next one. And sometimes that's one of the most valuable skills a director can have. Not making audiences admire the movie, making sure they never want to stop watching it. Something that surprised me while revisiting Shooter is how much of the movie's identity comes from its presentation, not the plot. Not the conspiracy, not even Swagger himself. The overall look and feel of the movie does a lot of work in selling this world. Because let's be honest, if this exact same script had been shot poorly, I don't think we'd still be talking about it nearly as much. One of the first things that stands out is the cinematography. There are a lot of action thrillers from the mid-2000s that have aged in a very specific way. Everything feels overly gray, overly shaky, and visually interchangeable. You watch them now and struggle to remember a single image after they're over. Shooter avoids that problem more than I expected. The movie actually has some genuinely memorable visuals. The mountain sequences early on are probably the best example. Those wide landscapes immediately establish Swagger's isolation. Before he says much of anything, the environment is already telling you who he is. He's distant from society, distant from institutions, distant from everything that caused him pain. It's simple visual storytelling, but it works. And throughout the film, there's a recurring contrast between open spaces and confined spaces that I found interesting. When Swagger is alone in nature, the camera often breathes a little more. The shots feel wider, calmer. Once the conspiracy closes in around him, everything starts feeling tighter, more controlled, more restrictive. I don't know if every viewer consciously notices that, but it contributes to the atmosphere. The film generally looks bigger than it actually is. That's something I appreciate. There are movies with enormous budgets that somehow feel small, and there are movies that understand how to maximize every location they have available. Shooter falls into the second category more often than not. The scenery helps too. Whether it's snowy mountains, forests, city streets, government buildings, or isolated rural locations, the film keeps changing environments enough that it never becomes visually stale. You're constantly moving through different spaces. And because the story itself is built around pursuit, that variety matters. Now let's talk about the action photography for a second. One thing I like is that the movie usually lets you understand what's happening. That sounds like a low bar, but action cinema has spent years proving that it isn't. Too many thrillers confuse chaos with excitement. The camera shakes. The editing accelerates. Everything becomes a blur of movement. Shooter isn't perfect, but most of the time you know where people are, what they're doing, and why the scene matters. There's a clarity to the action, especially during the sniper sequences. The film understands that distance is part of the tension. Instead of cutting frantically every second, it often allows shots to breathe long enough for you to appreciate the setup. You understand the geography. You understand the objective. Then the payoff arrives. That structure works really well. The special effects are interesting because they sit somewhere in the middle. Some moments still hold up nicely. Others definitely remind you this movie came out in 2007. That's probably inevitable. Technology changes. Visual effects evolve. What looked impressive years ago doesn't always carry the same impact today. The good news is that Shooter relies heavily on practical action, physical locations, and real-world environments. Because of that, the film ages more gracefully than some of its contemporaries. There's enough tangible reality on screen to anchor everything. And honestly, that's probably why many of the action sequences still feel satisfying. Then there's the editing. I mentioned earlier that the movie moves quickly, and a lot of that comes down to how it's assembled. The editing rarely draws attention to itself. It's not flashy. It's not trying to impress you with stylistic tricks. Its primary goal is momentum. Information comes in. The story advances. The next problem appears. The next lead emerges. The next threat arrives. The movie keeps moving, sometimes almost relentlessly. That pace becomes one of its greatest strengths. Even when certain plot details don't entirely hold up under scrutiny, the film is usually halfway into the next scene before you spend too much time thinking about them. And I mean that as a compliment. Now, the music isn't necessarily something people talk about when discussing Shooter, but it deserves a little recognition. The score understands its role. It doesn't try to dominate scenes. It doesn't constantly scream for attention. Instead, it quietly supports the tension. A lot of conspiracy thrillers make the mistake of overselling every moment. The music starts telling you exactly how nervous, excited, or emotional you're supposed to feel. Shooter is generally more restrained than that. The soundtrack knows when to step forward and when to stay out of the way. That's harder than it sounds. What's interesting about all these technical elements is that none of them individually redefine the genre. You probably won't finish the movie thinking you've witnessed groundbreaking cinematography, or revolutionary editing, or a score for the ages. That's not really the point. The strength of Shooter comes from how all these pieces work together. The visuals support the tension. The editing supports the momentum. The locations support the atmosphere. The action photography supports the suspense. Everything is working toward the same objective. Keep the audience engaged, keep them moving, keep them invested in Swagger's journey. And when I look back at the movie, that's probably one of its most underrated achievements. The technical presentation rarely calls attention to itself, but it's quietly doing its job in almost every scene. You may not leave Shooter talking about the cinematography for weeks, but without it, the movie wouldn't be nearly as effective as it is. The more I watched Shooter, the more I realize that the writing is probably the most complicated thing to talk about, not because it's difficult to understand. Actually, it's kind of the opposite. The screenplay constantly walks this strange line between being smarter than a typical action movie and simpler than it sometimes wants to appear. And honestly, that's part of what makes it interesting. At its core, the story is built around a very reliable formula. A skilled man gets betrayed. Powerful people cover their tracks. The hero is forced to survive, uncover the truth, and eventually fight back. There's nothing revolutionary about that setup. In fact, most viewers can probably predict the general direction of the story fairly early on. The movie knows this. It doesn't spend much energy trying to hide where it's going. Instead, it focuses on the details surrounding the journey. Who can be trusted? Who's manipulating events? How far does the conspiracy reach? Those questions become more important than the destination itself. And for the most part, that works. One thing I appreciate is that the screenplay doesn't waste much time. Some thrillers spend an hour setting up the conflict before anything meaningful happens. Shooters gets there pretty quickly. Swagger is introduced. The mission is established. The trap is sprung. The chase begins. The story understands that momentum is one of its greatest strengths, so it rarely lingers longer than necessary. At the same time, there are moments where the writing feels almost too eager to explain itself. You'll occasionally get scenes where characters state things that the audience has already figured out, not constantly, but enough that you notice it. It's one of those habits a lot of conspiracy thrillers fall into. The writers want to make sure everyone is following the plot, so they sometimes over-clarify information that was already clear. When that happens, the dialogue can feel a little mechanical, like characters are speaking for the audience's benefit rather than speaking naturally to each other. Then again, there are other moments where the dialogue works surprisingly well, especially during conversations involving military expertise, investigations, or tactical planning. Those scenes tend to have a different energy. People sound like they know what they're talking about. The exchanges feel more specific, more confident. The movie is often at its strongest when characters are discussing something practical rather than explaining the conspiracy. You can feel the difference. Another thing I noticed is that Shooter has a decent sense of humor, even if it's not a comedy. The film isn't packed with jokes, but there are occasional moments where characters interact in ways that feel relaxed and human. Those scenes matter. Without them, the movie could become relentlessly serious. And a story filled with corruption, murder, betrayal, and government conspiracies desperately needs occasional moments to breathe. Now, the screenplay does run into a common problem. The conspiracy itself keeps expanding. And as it expands, the amount of information being delivered increases as well. That creates a balancing act. The writers need to keep the audience informed without turning every scene into a lecture. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they don't. There are stretches where the movie flows naturally from clue to clue. Then there are moments where it feels like someone has entered the room carrying a folder full of plot information and needs to distribute it before the next action sequence begins. It's not disastrous, it's just noticeable. What's interesting is that the screenplay often succeeds less because of its surprises and more because of its structure. Even when you can predict where the story is heading, the movie usually knows how to create small objectives that keep you engaged. Swagger needs to find somebody. Then he needs to escape somebody. Then he needs proof. Then he needs an ally. Then he needs another piece of information. The story keeps creating short-term goals, and those goals keep generating momentum. It's a simple technique, but an effective one. One area where I think the writing leaves a little on the table is character exploration. There are hints of deeper material throughout the movie. Questions about loyalty, patriotism, institutional failure, personal guilt, the cost of revenge. The script occasionally brushes against those ideas, but rarely stays with them for very long. Usually because there's another plot development waiting nearby. You can almost feel the movie making a choice. Interesting emotional conversation, or sniper chase? And almost every time, it chooses the sniper chase. Again, that's not necessarily wrong. It's just a reflection of the movie's priorities. Shooter wants to entertain first. Everything else comes second. And honestly, I think the screenplay understands that better than some people give it credit for. It doesn't pretend to be an intellectual political drama. It doesn't pretend to be a profound character study. It knows it's an action thriller. A very polished action thriller, but an action thriller nonetheless. So while the writing occasionally becomes predictable, occasionally over-explains itself, and occasionally sacrifices depth for momentum, it also knows how to keep an audience engaged, and that's a skill in itself. By the time the movie reaches its later stages, you may not be hanging on every line of dialogue. You may not be shocked by every revelation, but you're still invested in the outcome. You're still curious about what happens next, and from a screenwriting perspective, that's probably the biggest compliment I can give it. The script understands how to keep turning pages, even when you're fairly sure you know what's written on the next one. One thing I kept noticing while watching Shooter is that the movie seems very aware of a simple fact. If it slows down too much, the whole thing probably falls apart. And I don't mean that negatively. I mean it as an observation about how the film is built. Because when you really look at the story, there are plenty of moments where the audience could stop and start asking uncomfortable questions. Questions about the conspiracy. Questions about certain plot conveniences. Questions about whether Swagger should realistically be able to do half the things he's doing. The movie solution is surprisingly effective. Keep moving, not recklessly, just consistently. That's probably the best word for the pacing in Shooter. Consistent. From the opening mission onward, the film always feels like it's heading somewhere. Even during its quieter moments, there's usually another problem approaching in the distance. Another clue, another threat, another person who can't be trusted, another place Swagger needs to go. The story rarely allows itself to become comfortable. And because of that, the audience rarely becomes comfortable either. What I appreciate is that the movie doesn't confuse pacing with speed. Those aren't the same thing. A fast movie can still feel exhausting. A slower movie can still feel engaging. The goal isn't constant movement. The goal is maintaining interest. For the most part, Shooter understands that. There are stretches where almost nothing explodes, and yet you're still paying attention because the film is feeding you just enough information to stay invested. That's a good sign. The pacing isn't being carried solely by action scenes. It's being carried by curiosity. You want to know what happens next. That's really what pacing comes down to, not how quickly events occur, whether the audience cares about the next event, and Shooter generally does a solid job creating that feeling. What's interesting is how the movie divides its energy. The first act moves surprisingly quickly. The setup is established. Swagger is recruited. The trap is sprung. The central conflict arrives much earlier than some thrillers would allow. I actually think that was a smart decision. A lesser version of this movie probably spends 45 minutes explaining military backgrounds, political motivations, and character histories before getting to the main story. Shooter gets there fast. Maybe not lightning fast, but fast enough. Then comes the middle section, which is usually where conspiracy thrillers either find their rhythm or completely lose it, because this is the part where information starts piling up. New names appear, hidden motives emerge, investigations begin, secrets get exposed, and suddenly the movie has to juggle a lot of moving pieces. This is where I expected Shooter to drag. Surprisingly, it mostly doesn't. There are definitely a few moments where the story gets a little tangled in its own explanations. A couple of scenes linger longer than necessary. A few conversations feel like they're carrying a lot of exposition on their backs. But the film rarely stays stuck in those moments for long. Whenever things start slowing down, another development arrives and pushes the story forward again. It's almost like the movie has a built-in alarm system. The second the energy dips too low, something happens. And honestly, that's probably why the runtime feels shorter than it actually is. Now, that doesn't mean the pacing is perfect. There are areas where I think the film could have benefited from a little more patience. Some relationships feel underdeveloped because the movie is so eager to move on. Certain emotional beats arrive and disappear before they fully settle. A few supporting characters could have used an extra scene or two. You occasionally get the feeling that the movie is skipping past opportunities for deeper character work because it's worried about losing momentum, and maybe it is. That's the trade-off. The film chooses movement over reflection more often than not. Whether that's the right choice depends on what you're looking for. If you're here for an action thriller, it's probably the correct decision. If you're hoping for a more character-driven experience, you might find yourself wanting the movie to slow down occasionally and let things breathe. Then there's the final stretch. And this is where pacing becomes especially important because audiences are usually checking out by this point if the movie hasn't earned their attention. Thankfully, Shooter understands the assignment. The closer it gets to the climax, the more focused it becomes. Objectives become clearer. Conflicts become more direct. The story stops expanding and starts narrowing. That's exactly what you want. Too many conspiracy thrillers keep adding complications right up until the end. Shooter eventually stops building outward and starts driving straight toward its conclusion. The result is a finale that feels like a payoff rather than another detour. And honestly, when I think about why the movie remains so watchable, pacing is probably one of the biggest reasons. Not because every scene is brilliant, not because every subplot works, not because every revelation lands, but because the film rarely gives you a reason to stop paying attention. It's always moving, always introducing another problem, always setting up another confrontation, always giving you one more reason to keep watching. For a movie built around a man constantly staying one step ahead of danger, that feels oddly appropriate. The pacing operates the same way Swagger does. It keeps moving forward before you have time to catch it. At some point while watching Shooter, every viewer probably reaches the same crossroads. You either say, okay, that's a little ridiculous, or you shrug and say, you know what, I'm having fun. And honestly, both reactions are completely fair. Because Shooter spends a lot of its runtime walking a very thin line between realism and pure action movie fantasy. What's funny is that the movie starts off feeling surprisingly grounded. The sniper discussions feel detailed. The military background feels researched. The tactical planning has enough specificity to make you think the filmmakers genuinely cared about this stuff. Even Swagger himself initially feels believable. Not ordinary, obviously, but believable. He's presented as somebody with an extremely specialized skill set rather than a superhero. For a while, the movie works hard to convince you that success comes from preparation, experience, and knowledge. Then the story progresses. And suddenly you're watching a man survive situations that would probably send most people directly into a hospital or a cemetery. That's when the Hollywood side starts taking over. Now, to be clear, this isn't necessarily a criticism. Action movies have always operated on a slightly different version of reality. Nobody complains when James Bond survives things that should be impossible. Nobody questions why Jason Bourne can seemingly outmaneuver entire intelligence agencies. The genre depends on exceptional people doing exceptional things. Shooter isn't any different. The challenge is maintaining the illusion. And, for the most part, the film does a decent job of it. Because even when Swagger starts accomplishing things that seem highly optimistic, the movie usually grounds those moments in his expertise. The explanation is almost always the same. He's smarter, he's better prepared, he's thinking ahead. Whether that's enough to justify every escape is debatable, but at least the movie is consistent. It doesn't rely entirely on luck. Most of the time, it wants you to believe Swagger survives because he's operating on a different level than everyone around him. What's interesting is that the movie sometimes feels torn between two identities. One version wants to be a realistic military thriller. The other wants to be an old-school revenge fantasy. And depending on the scene, one side tends to win out over the other. You'll have a sequence that feels methodical and authentic, filled with careful planning and tactical thinking. Then, 5 minutes later, you'll get a moment that reminds you this is still a Hollywood action movie at heart. The shift can be a little jarring, but it's also part of the movie's charm. Because Shooter never becomes fully grounded, and it never becomes completely outrageous either. It exists somewhere in the middle. That's actually a harder balance to maintain than people realize. Go too realistic, and you risk losing the escapism that audiences enjoy. Go too exaggerated, and the stakes stop feeling meaningful. The film spends most of its runtime trying to stay between those extremes, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Another thing I found interesting is how the movie handles competence. A lot of action films make their heroes look impressive by making everyone else look incompetent. Shooter doesn't always do that. The people hunting Swagger aren't complete fools. The conspiracy isn't staffed entirely by idiots. The authorities aren't incapable. Swagger succeeds because he's unusually capable, not because everyone around him suddenly forgets how to do their jobs. That distinction matters. It helps preserve the illusion that he's overcoming real obstacles rather than artificial ones. Now, if you're the type of viewer who analyzes every detail for realism, there are definitely moments that will test your patience. Certain injuries heal suspiciously fast. Certain escapes seem extremely convenient. Certain decisions feel designed for maximum entertainment rather than maximum logic. You'll notice them. I notice them. The movie notices them too, honestly. It just doesn't care very much. Because Shooter is ultimately more interested in delivering satisfaction than strict realism. That's its priority. And once you accept that, a lot of the movie becomes easier to appreciate. One thing I always find fascinating is how audiences react differently to this kind of film. Some people embrace the fantasy immediately. They don't need every detail to be realistic. They just want a compelling hero, a dangerous enemy, and a satisfying journey from beginning to end. Others want the movie to fully commit to its military thriller roots and stay grounded throughout. Neither perspective is wrong. The film simply occupies a space where those expectations occasionally collide. Personally, I think Shooter works best when viewed as a thriller that borrows realism rather than worships it. It takes enough authentic details to create credibility, enough military knowledge to create immersion, enough tactical realism to create tension. Then it layers a larger-than-life action story on top of all of that. That's really the formula. And whether that formula works for you probably depends on how much you're willing to meet the movie halfway. Because the truth is, Shooter isn't asking you to believe everything. It's asking you to believe just enough to care about Swagger, just enough to enjoy the chase, just enough to root for the outcome. After that, it lets the spectacle take over. And for a lot of viewers, that's exactly why the movie remains so entertaining years later. Now, as much as I've enjoyed talking about what SS Shooter does well, this is probably the point where we need to address the things that don't work quite as smoothly. Because there are definitely moments where the movie asks for a little more trust than it has earned, and sometimes a lot more. The biggest criticism is probably one that hits pretty early. The setup is effective, but it isn't exactly subtle. The moment certain characters enter the story, most viewers are already suspicious of them. You know that feeling when somebody in a thriller is being just a little too helpful? Yeah, Shooter runs into that problem. There were several moments where I found myself thinking, okay, I probably know where this is going. And more often than not, I was right. That's not necessarily a deal breaker. Plenty of good movies are predictable. The problem is that the film occasionally treats certain revelations as shocking discoveries when the audience arrived at those conclusions 20 minutes earlier. Those moments lose some impact because the surprise has already happened in your head. What's interesting, though, is that the movie seems aware of this on some level. It rarely relies entirely on twists to keep you invested. Instead, it shifts the focus toward execution. The question becomes less, what's happening, and more, how is Swagger going to get out of this? That's probably a smart adjustment. Still, there are definitely stretches where the plot feels a little too transparent. Then there's the issue of convenience, and this is where things get tricky, because every action thriller depends on coincidence to some degree. Characters need to find clues. People need to cross paths. Certain events need to happen at exactly the right moment. That's normal. But Shooter occasionally stacks those moments a little too closely together. Sometimes Swagger discovers information at exactly the moment he needs it. Sometimes allies appear just in time. Sometimes events line up so perfectly that you can almost hear the screenplay working behind the scenes. Again, not enough to completely break the movie. Just enough to remind you that you're watching a movie. Another criticism I kept coming back to involves the conspiracy itself. Earlier I mentioned that the conspiracy works well as a source of tension. I still believe that. But the larger it becomes, the fuzzier some of the details start feeling. At first, everything seems relatively straightforward. Then new layers get added. Then more people become involved. Then additional motives emerge. Eventually, the conspiracy becomes so large that certain specifics begin blending together. You understand the general picture. You understand who's responsible. But some of the finer details don't always land with the clarity the movie probably wants. It's one of those stories where the overall idea is stronger than every individual piece supporting it. And that's okay. Most viewers are probably following the emotional conflict more than the organizational chart of the conspiracy anyway. One area where I think the screenplay struggles a little is exposition. Not constantly, not disastrously. But there are scenes where characters explain things that don't necessarily need explaining. Information gets repeated. Motivations get clarified. Connections get outlined. The movie occasionally worries that the audience might be lost and responds by explaining itself more than necessary. Ironically, some of the strongest scenes are the ones where it trusts viewers to keep up. Those scenes tend to feel more natural, more confident. The film is generally at its best when it's showing rather than explaining. Then we have the issue that every action hero eventually runs into, the competence problem. Swagger is incredibly skilled. That much is established from the beginning, no issue there. The challenge is that his skill set keeps expanding as the movie progresses. At first, he's a world-class sniper, makes sense. Then he's an elite tracker. Then he's a survival expert. Then he's a strategist. Then he's performing emergency medical procedures. Then he's building things, analyzing things, predicting things. At a certain point, you start wondering if there is literally anything this man can't do. And honestly, the movie never really answers that question, because every time he's backed into a corner, he finds another way out. Now, some viewers love that. Others find it difficult to accept. I can understand both reactions. Personally, I think the movie mostly gets away with it because Swagger's competence is established early and remains consistent. The problem would be worse if these abilities appeared out of nowhere. Still, there are moments where the character drifts from highly trained professional into near-legendary action figure territory, and not everyone is going to buy into that transition. Another thing I noticed is that some emotional storylines feel underdeveloped. The film introduces interesting ideas involving grief, loyalty, betrayal, and loss, then occasionally rushes past them. There are relationships that could have been explored further, characters who could have used more screen time, moments that feel like the beginning of a deeper conversation rather than the completion of one. You can almost sense the movie looking at those opportunities and deciding, maybe later. Then later never arrives, because another chase sequence shows up, or another conspiracy reveal, or another action scene. And suddenly we're moving again. What's funny is that none of these criticisms completely sink the movie. Usually when a film accumulates this many little issues, it starts collapsing under its own weight. That never really happens here. The flaws are real. The plot gets messy occasionally. The logic wobbles. The twists can be obvious. The hero can feel invincible. The conspiracy can become overcomplicated. All of that is true, and yet the movie remains surprisingly watchable. Maybe because it understands exactly what audiences came for. Maybe because the pacing keeps carrying it forward. Maybe because Mark Wahlberg's performance holds everything together. Or maybe it's simply because the film never stops entertaining long enough for its problems to become fatal. Whatever the reason, Shooter is one of those movies where the flaws are easy to spot, but somehow they're never quite enough to stop the ride. One thing I found myself thinking about more during this rewatch than I did years ago is how much violence there actually is in Shooter, not just in terms of body count, in terms of purpose, because those are two very different things. A lot of action movies treat violence almost like decoration. It exists because the genre expects it. Heroes fight villains, things explode, bad guys get thrown through windows, and everyone moves on. Shooter isn't necessarily trying to be profound about violence, but it does give it a little more weight than I remembered, at least some of the time. Early in the movie, violence feels tied directly to survival. Swagger isn't hunting people, he's escaping people. That's an important distinction. The audience naturally accepts a lot when a character is trying to stay alive. Someone is chasing him, someone wants him dead. The system has turned against him. In those situations, most viewers don't spend much time questioning whether his actions are justified. They're focused on whether he'll survive. And the movie knows that. It uses that survival instinct to build sympathy. The more pressure Swagger faces, the easier it becomes to root for him, even when things start getting messy. What's interesting, though, is how gradually the story shifts. At first, he's reacting. Then he's investigating. Then he's exposing the truth. And eventually, whether the film openly says it or not, revenge becomes part of the equation. Not just justice, revenge. There's a subtle difference there. Justice is usually about accountability. Revenge is personal. And Shooter increasingly starts operating in that personal space. The people responsible aren't just obstacles anymore. They're symbols of betrayal, symbols of corruption, symbols of everything that was taken from him. That emotional shift changes the way the violence feels. The audience isn't simply watching a man clear his name. They're watching a man settle scores. Now here's where things get interesting. Most revenge thrillers don't really want you to question the revenge. They want you to enjoy it. The villains are awful. The hero is wronged. The outcome feels deserved. Problem solved. Shooter mostly follows that tradition. Let's be honest, the movie isn't interested in holding a philosophical debate every time somebody gets shot. It's built to deliver satisfaction. And when the villains finally start facing consequences, the film clearly expects the audience to enjoy it. In many cases, they probably will. I think that's one reason the movie remains so popular with action thriller fans. There's a very clear emotional payoff built into the story. The people abusing power aren't misunderstood. They aren't morally complicated. The film presents them as individuals who have escaped accountability for far too long. So when the reckoning arrives, the audience doesn't have to spend much time deciding how they feel about it. The movie has already made that decision. But if you step back for a second, there is an interesting tension underneath all of this. Because the story is ultimately about a man who stops believing institutions can deliver justice. That's really what drives everything. Swagger doesn't trust the system anymore. He doesn't believe the truth will be enough. He doesn't believe the people responsible will willingly face consequences. And whether the movie intends it or not, that's a pretty cynical worldview. The implication is that corruption has become so deeply rooted that traditional solutions aren't enough. Only direct action works. That's a powerful fantasy. It's also a slightly uncomfortable one when you think about it too long, and I don't mean that as criticism. Actually, I think that's part of why the film resonates with audiences. There's something emotionally satisfying about watching somebody fight back against forces that seem untouchable. People respond to that. They always have. The danger, of course, is that revenge stories often simplify complicated moral questions into very simple emotional ones. Good people, bad people, payback, closure. Reality is usually messier. Shooter isn't particularly interested in that messiness. It chooses clarity over ambiguity almost every time. The villains deserve punishment, the hero deserves vindication, the audience deserves a payoff. That's the framework. And honestly, for this kind of movie, it works. What I appreciate is that the violence rarely feels completely detached from consequences. When people get hurt, the film generally treats it seriously. Injuries matter. Deaths matter. Actions create reactions. This isn't a world where entire city blocks explode and everyone casually moves on to the next scene. There are stakes. Maybe not always realistic stakes, but recognizable ones. And that helps keep the movie grounded, even when the story itself starts drifting toward larger-than-life territory. By the end, I don't think Shooter is trying to make a grand statement about morality. It's not that kind of film. It's an action thriller first and foremost, a revenge story second. Everything else comes after that. But buried underneath all the shootouts and conspiracies is a recurring idea that gives the movie a little more substance than people sometimes acknowledge. What happens when someone loses faith in every system that was supposed to protect them? And what happens when they decide the only justice they trust is the justice they deliver themselves? As Shooter doesn't spend much time debating those questions, it mostly turns them into entertainment. But the questions are still there. And I think that's part of what makes the movie more interesting than a standard action thriller on the surface. It isn't just about violence. It's about why that violence starts feeling justified in the first place, and how easily audiences are willing to go along with it once they've chosen a side. One of the most interesting things about Shooter is that it never feels like it's trying to invent a new genre. It knows exactly what kind of movie it is, and honestly, I think that's one of its strengths. Some films spend so much time trying to convince you they're unique that they lose sight of what made audiences interested in the first place. Shooter doesn't have that problem. It seems completely comfortable living inside a collection of ideas we've seen before. The question isn't whether it's familiar. The question is which familiar things it's pulling from. Because when you start looking closely, Shooter feels like several different genres quietly sharing the same movie. At its core, it's obviously an action thriller. That's the foundation everything else sits on. A highly skilled protagonist, powerful enemies, a conspiracy, a chase, a revenge-driven payoff. Those ingredients have been around forever, but that's only part of the picture. The movie also spends a surprising amount of time operating like a fugitive thriller. For a large portion of the story, Swagger isn't hunting anybody. He's running, trying to survive, trying to stay ahead of people with far more resources than he has. And that creates a very different energy than a traditional action movie. The tension isn't coming from whether he can defeat someone in a fight. The tension comes from whether he can avoid getting caught long enough to fight back at all. That's a different kind of suspense. Then there's the conspiracy thriller side of the film. The deeper Swagger digs, the more the movie starts leaning into paranoia. Information becomes unreliable. Official narratives become questionable. Power starts operating behind closed doors. The story constantly pushes the idea that what appears to be true and what is actually true are two completely different things. Those elements give the film a slightly darker tone than a straightforward action adventure. not dark enough to become cynical all the time, but dark enough to create unease. What's funny is that every time the movie starts feeling like a serious political thriller, it immediately remembers that it's also an action movie. Then somebody starts getting chased, or shot at, or both, and the balance shifts again. I think that's why the film appeals to such a broad audience. Action fans can enjoy it as a revenge thriller. Conspiracy fans can enjoy it as a story about corruption and cover-ups. Military thriller fans can focus on the tactical and sniper elements. Different viewers are often watching the same movie for completely different reasons. That's actually harder to pull off than it sounds. Now, one comparison that inevitably comes up is the one-man against the system tradition, and Shooter fits comfortably into that lineage. The details change from movie to movie, but the fantasy remains largely the same. An individual discovers something powerful people want hidden. The system turns against him. He refuses to back down. The audience gets to watch somebody challenge forces that seem impossible to defeat. It's a formula that's been working for decades because there's something universally appealing about it. People naturally respond to underdog stories, especially when the underdog happens to be extremely dangerous. At the same time, Shooter occasionally flirts with elements of noir storytelling, not visually necessarily, more thematically. The mistrust, the betrayals, the sense that institutions are compromised, the feeling that the truth is buried beneath layers of manipulation. Those ideas have been living inside noir stories for generations. The movie never fully embraces that identity, but you can see traces of it, especially in the way it views power. One thing I find fascinating is that despite all these influences, Shooters never feels particularly concerned with originality, and I don't mean that as an insult. Actually, I think it's refreshing. There are movies that desperately want to surprise you every 5 minutes. Shooter mostly wants to entertain you. Those are different goals. The film isn't constantly trying to reinvent familiar genre conventions. It's trying to execute them effectively. Sometimes that's enough. In fact, I think that's one reason the movie has aged better than some people expected. Because it isn't dependent on a gimmick. It isn't built around a single shocking twist. It isn't chasing trends. It's built around a collection of genre mechanics that have worked for a very long time. A capable hero, a dangerous conspiracy, a clear objective, escalating stakes, a satisfying payoff, simple ingredients, reliable ingredients. Now, if you're looking for a movie that completely redefines the action thriller genre, Shooter probably isn't going to be that movie. It borrows too much from existing traditions for that. The structure feels familiar. The character archetypes feel familiar. Even some of the story beats feel familiar. But familiarity isn't always a weakness. Sometimes familiarity creates comfort. Sometimes it creates momentum. Sometimes it allows a movie to focus less on surprising the audience and more on satisfying them. And that's really where I think Shooter lands. It isn't trying to become the most original thriller ever made. It's trying to become an effective thriller. There's a difference. One goal is much harder to achieve. The other is much harder to sustain. The fact that people are still talking about this movie years later suggests it probably achieved more of that second goal than it's often given credit for. Because while Shooter may not reinvent any of the genres it touches, it understands them well enough to combine them into something consistently entertaining. And sometimes that's exactly what audiences are looking for. I think one of the biggest challenges for a movie like Shooter is figuring out how to end. That sounds obvious, but it's actually harder than it seems. Because once you've spent nearly 2 hours building a conspiracy, exposing corruption, framing an innocent man, and making your villains increasingly powerful, the audience eventually starts expecting a payoff that feels worth the journey. You can't spend all that time building frustration and then deliver something small. The movie knows this, maybe a little too well. By the time we reach the final act, Shooter stops behaving like a mystery. The investigation phase is basically over. The audience understands who the major players are. Swagger understands who the major players are. The movie understands exactly what experience it's trying to deliver. It doesn't get distracted, it doesn't overcomplicate itself, and because of that, it remains approachable, even years later. Now, if we're talking about its place within action, thriller history, I don't think Shooter fundamentally changed the genre. It didn't launch a new filmmaking movement. It didn't redefine action cinema. It didn't alter the way thrillers were made afterward. Its influence is relatively modest. But influence and endurance aren't always the same thing. Some movies become important. Other movies become reliable. Shooter belongs firmly in that second category. It's the kind of film people continue recommending when someone asks for a solid conspiracy thriller, a satisfying revenge story, an entertaining action movie. A good example of a one-man against the system narrative. And honestly, that's not a bad legacy. Not every film needs to become legendary. Sometimes being consistently enjoyable is enough. When I look back at Shooter, that's probably what stands out most. Not that it changed cinema. Not that it revolutionized storytelling. Not that it reached some untouchable level of greatness. It's that nearly 2 decades later, people are still watching it, still recommending it, and still finding it entertaining. A lot of movies would love to age that well. And whether you're watching it for the first time or the 5th, that's probably the clearest sign that Shooter got more right than wrong. So after everything, the conspiracies, the sniper battles, the political corruption, the manhunts, the revenge, the plot twists, the things that work, and the things that definitely don't, where does Shooter ultimately land? Honestly, it's a better movie than some people remember, and a less important movie than its biggest fans sometimes claim. And I think that's exactly where it belongs, because one of the easiest mistakes people make when discussing movies is treating everything as either a masterpiece or a failure. Shooter is neither. It's something much more interesting. It's a movie that understands its assignment. From the moment it begins, it knows what experience it's trying to deliver. It isn't chasing prestige. It isn't trying to reinvent the action genre. It isn't trying to become a deep political examination of power and corruption. It has a much simpler goal. Take a compelling protagonist, place him inside a dangerous conspiracy, surround him with impossible odds, and make the audience want to see him win. That's the mission. And for the most part, it accomplishes it. Now, that doesn't mean the film is above criticism. Far from it. The plot occasionally stretches credibility. Some twists are easy to predict. The conspiracy can become a little messy. Several supporting characters deserved more development. And there are moments where Swagger feels less like a highly trained sniper and more like a force of nature disguised as a human being. Those issues are real. You notice them. I notice them. The movie never completely escapes them. But what's fascinating is how rarely those flaws damage the overall experience. Because every time the story starts wobbling, something else pulls it back into place. The pacing keeps moving. The tension keeps building. The action remains entertaining. The central performance stays committed. And most importantly, the audience remains invested. That's not an accident. That's a movie understanding where its strengths are. One thing I appreciate more now than I did years ago is how confident Shooter feels. Not confident in the sense that it believes it's making a grand artistic statement. Confident in the sense that it knows exactly what kind of thriller it wants to be. There's no identity crisis here. The film isn't constantly changing direction. It isn't trying to satisfy every possible audience. It picks a lane and stays in it. Sometimes that's more valuable than ambition, because there are plenty of movies that reach higher and achieve less. Shooter aims for something specific and hits that target more often than it misses. What really holds everything together, though, is Bob Lee Swagger. The conspiracy works because of him.